Hello, welcome to today's PIER public seminar. I'm Sue Narski and I am cosplaying Tom Paine today. I am hosting this evening's event. Thanks to those who are here. We also got people online. The session's being recorded, so watch your mouth when you're asking questions. That comment is directed at me, and now I get to actually say it to you guys. I've gotten in trouble with a couple of questions I've asked. Questions are typically asked econ style throughout the event, so don't be shy. Just raise your hand if you want to ask a question. Is that right?
Definitely.
That's right. Okay. So I want to give a warm welcome to our speaker, Zachary Bleemer. He is an assistant professor of econ at Princeton in the industrial relations section, which has been doing, it's been sort of the center of labor economics research for decades. Many a Nobel Prize has come out of there. Zach is also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and an associate at Opportunity Insights in the Center for Studies in Higher Education. Zach focuses on post-secondary education and its role or not role in mobility and inequality, and has done a lot of super interesting work using both administrative data and survey data, and he's going to tell you all about it.
Thank you very much, Sue. Great. And thanks to all of you. Thanks for the invitation to be here. Yeah, I'll emphasize that please feel free to ask questions during the talk, though I'll make sure to save some time for questions at the end. So this is a paper that's joined with Jerry Janes at Yale, and we're asking about the effects of affirmative action on white and Asian students. And I think it's worth just motivating for a moment first, what is affirmative action, and then why we would focus on white and Asian students' effects. So first, let me just start by telling you what affirmative action is. This is an admissions grid that was used at UC Berkeley in 1995. One of the last years in which Berkeley used affirmative action in its admissions policies. So the way this grid works is, sorry, it's a little bit small. Along the top, you have academic index brackets. Academic index is GPA, top coded at 4 times 1,000, plus your SAT score, plus your SAT scores on 3 SAT2 subject-specific exams. So it's out of 8,000 points. The top bracket is people with a 7,100 and above, and then there's brackets below. And then along the side here, we have what Berkeley called a social diversity index. So that runs from A to I. To give you an example, a low-income black student would be an A. A high-income black student would be a B. Let's see, a black student, actually a non-Californian Chicano high-income student, I think would be an E. An international student would be an I. And the way the grid works is the higher your social diversity index, the lower the guaranteed bar that you needed in your academic index. So the idea is, if you're an A, everyone with a 6250 or above was guaranteed admission to UC Berkeley in this year. If you're an I, you were only guaranteed admission above this line at a 7150. All right, so the higher your social index, the lower test score you needed to get into Berkeley. Then there's this middle period that they called read. Read means some kids got in and some kids didn't. So they went through the full application and made determinations on a case-by-case basis using holistic review. And then there was what they called deny with options, that in almost all cases just meant deny, and then rejection down here. So affirmative action, as implemented in California in the 1990s, was just a lower admissions bar for certain preferential social and diversity groups. Here's what affirmative action as a result looked like in practice. So let's focus on the figure here on the left. This is UC Berkeley admission by academic index for, in blue, white and Asian students, and in red, Black, Hispanic, and Native American students. Couple of things to note here. First, here's the guaranteed admission, right? Everyone above that score gets in. You can see for Black and Hispanic students, it's a little bit noisy, but the guaranteed admission for Black and Hispanic students comes a little bit lower and then starts falling off. But notice a couple more things. There's a very dramatic decline for white and Asian students right at that admissions guarantee, whereas the decline for Black and Hispanic students is much smoother over this academic index space. As a result, there are certain academic indices, so call it like here at like a 6750 or so. You can see that 6750s who are white or Asian have basically no shot of getting into UC Berkeley. Less than 10% of them got in. where Black and Hispanic students were nearly guaranteed admission. More than 90% of Black and Hispanic students with those grades and test scores were admitted to UC Berkeley. So that's what affirmative action is. It's not like a light touch policy that provides small admissions advantages to Black and Hispanic students. It's clearly providing very substantial admissions preferences to targeted Black and Hispanic students. Here on the right is what it looks like for affirmative action to end. So California banned affirmative action by ballot proposition passed in 1996 and implemented in the fall of 1998. You can see that in the fall of 1998, these lines kind of collapse toward each other. But you'll also notice other changes. So the admission guarantee at the top for white and Asian students, and actually for Black and Hispanic students too, there's just so few that it kind of looks like there's still a guarantee, has disappeared. So Berkeley has gotten rid of its admissions grid completely. They've completely changed the way they run admissions. Now all students are getting something more like READ, something more like holistic review, and there are no guarantees. These lines have collapsed toward each other, but not completely. That's not because Berkeley is secretly doing affirmative action. It's because Berkeley continues to provide admissions advantages on the basis of characteristics that are correlated with race. So for example, they might target low SES students or kids from disadvantaged neighborhoods. I'll show you a little bit of evidence that starting in '99, Berkeley clearly started providing admissions advantages to kids from minority-majority high schools. So not targeting on the kid's own race, but targeting on characteristics about students that are highly correlated with race. Nevertheless, these lines have very substantially collapsed such that what used to be like 80 or 90 percentage point admissions advantages on the basis of race are now more like 20% advantages on the basis of not race, but information highly correlated with race. So this is what the end of affirmative action looks like, not a disappearance of Black and Hispanic students, but also not an admissions rule for Black and Hispanic students that looks exactly the same, at least just conditional on SAT score and test score and grades, as it does for white and Asian students. Okay, yeah, Peter. Okay, no, that's all I was going to say about this slide. Yeah.
Would it be a misnomer when we harken back to the time period where African Americans were not allowed to go to some of these schools to say that that was a form of affirmative action, but in a sense, affirmative action on the extensive margin where like people couldn't even get in, as opposed to this modern day affirmative action where conditional on being able to get in, you have a higher percentage of getting in?
I think it's a fantastic question. So I think a crucial point to keep in mind, as we're going to be talking just about California public universities today, is as of about 1960 to 1965, public universities in California were open access. There was no admissions department. There was no admissions sequence of any kind. If you graduated from a public or private high school in California that was licensed by the state of California to send students to four-year public universities, and you had sufficiently high grades to go to any four-year public university in California, you would have been guaranteed admission to Berkeley or any other UC campus of your choosing. It was only after the imposition of the California Master Plan, which dramatically expanded the size of California higher education, at the same time as even larger even larger increases in demands for higher education from California's high school graduates, that they had to implement any kind of selective admissions at all. So the master plan allowed for the use of selective admissions on the basis of test scores and grades. Berkeley was the first UC campus to do so in the mid-1960s. All of the campuses have now followed suit. But it was only in that transition from open access, which was true in most states in the US, that students had open access to all of the state's public universities, transition from open access to selectivity, that it becomes at all relevant how access to these schools differ by race or class. I should also note that in the same year that Berkeley began selective admissions, it began its affirmative action policy. So these two things, this meritocratic consensus of admissions and affirmative action, had always gone hand in hand in selective admissions. This was the first year, 1998, in which Berkeley was selective on the basis of academic preparation and did not provide admissions advantages on the basis of of race or, to a large degree, class. And so you should think of these things as going hand in hand until in 1998 they didn't. Whether you want to call what happened before 1965 affirmative action or not, I think I might leave to others. Yes?
I say more about the notes. Like over there it says that like it omits like applicants to high demand majors, so this policy did not apply.
Great. So all this is pointing out is Berkeley had separate admissions policies for its School of Engineering. Engineering students would have had relatively higher admissions bars. They also had an affirmative action program in place that also ended in 1998. If you include them, basically you just see lower admissions likelihoods all the way at the top. There are kids, even with very high SAT scores, who only applied to the engineering school and didn't get into those schools. That's not going to be much of the story that we're telling today. Okay, so we've now seen at least just what affirmative action does to admissions at universities. What I'm going to give you now 2 slides on is the last 5 years of my life trying to understand the ramifications of these changes for the economic outcomes of targeted Black and Hispanic students, economic outcomes for the white and Asian students who gained access to more selective universities when Black and Hispanic students lost access, and the ramifications of all of the policies that have been implemented since the end of affirmative action that have changed the composition of the University of California, the full set of public research universities in that state. So let me start with that last point. What we're looking at, we're just going to focus on this panel on the left. This panel just shows you for 3 different sets of University of California campuses. So in triangles, we have the most selective Berkeley and UCLA campuses. In squares here, we have the middle tier of campuses at San Diego, Davis, Irvine, and Santa Barbara. And then in circles, we have the least selective campuses at Santa Cruz and Riverside, and then starting in 2005, Merced. And what this figure is showing you is the share of all freshman enrollees at these schools who are URM, which is to say Black, Hispanic, or Native American. There's a comparison line here. This line is the share of all high school graduates from California high schools who were what was called UC eligible. This just means they had like a 3.0 GPA. They were eligible to apply to the University of California, though they were not guaranteed admission at any campus. What I want you to see is that after Proposition 209 banned affirmative action, you saw a very large decline in Black and Hispanic enrollment of almost 50% at the Berkeley and UCLA campuses. Sort of interestingly, you don't see anything happen to the share of URM students at the middle tier of UC campuses, and if anything, URM enrollment seems to increase a little bit at the Riverside and Santa Cruz campuses. That's going to be a key part of our story today. This is resulting from an enrollment cascade. There are a whole bunch of Black and Hispanic students who lose access to Berkeley and UCLA when affirmative action ends. Those students are still going to go to college somewhere. Most of them are going to end up in places like UC San Diego and UC Davis, which also had affirmative action programs that have now ended. Those schools lose relatively lower academic performing Black and Hispanic students and gain relatively higher academically performing Black and Hispanic students who had previously enrolled at more selective universities that themselves had ended their affirmative action programs. You can see that enrollment cascade here. Then you can also see what has happened in the subsequent 25 years in California. And basically what has happened is URM enrollment at the most selective and the middle tier of selective UC campuses has followed the state trend. URM enrollment has risen. Today at Berkeley and UCLA, it is roughly at the same level that it was in the pre-Prop 209 years. But that's in a world where the share of high school graduates in California who are Black or Hispanic has risen from roughly 25 to almost 50%, with all of that growth explained by Hispanic students. It's going to be important to keep in mind throughout this talk that only about 5% of Californians right now are Black. So URM is dominated by the Hispanic group in this setting. Okay, it should be noted that this is despite the fact that the University of California has implemented a number of policies with at least an implicit intention of increasing Black and Hispanic enrollment since the end of affirmative action. So in 2001, they implemented a top percent policy, ELC, that guaranteed top students from every high school access to most public universities in the state. That policy was expanded from the top 4% of students to the top 9% of students from each high school in 2011. 6 of these campuses have implemented a full-scale holistic review policy in their admissions where at least 2 readers have to read through the application, and they're not using a point system to allocate across students which ones get in. They're just using sort of the reported beliefs of admissions readers to decide who is admitted to these universities. And most notably, in 2020, these universities not only went test optional, they went test blind. They stopped using SATs in admissions completely. And it should be emphasized that despite all of those policy changes, you haven't seen anything like a recovery of Black and Hispanic student enrollment at the University of California campuses. Okay, so that's a second point I want you to keep in mind. Big declines in Black and Hispanic enrollment that were not regained in subsequent years at Berkeley and UCLA, whereas there were just changes in the composition of Black and Hispanic students at this middle and lower tier of UC campuses. Okay, a final point that I just wanted to at least talk about a little bit, which is the economic question here. So what happens to the Black and Hispanic students who lose access to more selective universities, and what happens to the white and Asian students who take their place at these universities? So this is formally published work. I'm only going to briefly mention what's going on here before moving on to today's question. But I wanted to at least mention that what happens when California ends affirmative action is shown in this figure. These are difference in differences, looking at what happens to Black and Hispanic students who apply to at least one University of California campus, relative to white and Asian students who apply to at least one University of California campus, in the years before and after the end of race-based affirmative action. This first panel is just indexing universities by their relative wage value to students on average, and showing that after affirmative action ends, Black and Hispanic students end up enrolling at relatively lower value universities. This is because they used to go to like Berkeley and UCLA, and now they go to Davis, or they used to go to Davis, and now they go to Riverside, etc. As a result of flowing into lower value universities, those at the bottom of the academic index distribution became less likely to ever earn a college degree. And across the academic index distribution, students became less likely to earn degrees in STEM fields, less likely to ever earn any kind of graduate degree driven by medicine and law. And if you look at their wages, they end up like 1 to 2 wage ranks on average across all Black and Hispanic students, lower in the within age, within race wage distribution relative to where they had been under the affirmative action regime. So you have this sort of cascade downward across university selectivity that is matched by a cascade downward in those Black and Hispanic students' medium-run educational and long-run labor market outcomes. Over the subsequent 25 years, these wage outcomes are measured when these kids are in their early 30s, so 15 years after the end of race-based affirmative action. This same study also looks at what happens to the white and Asian students who gained access to more selective universities and finds effectively null results. There's no evidence that white and Asian students gained from access to more selective schools. At the very least, it is almost surely the case that the losses faced by Black and Hispanic students exceeded the gains to white and Asian students, such that affirmative action was, in a sense, an efficient policy. It was targeting students who derived relatively greater value from access to more selective universities than the white and Asian students who replaced them. Okay, so that's just to sort of frame ideas. That's the policy we're going to be thinking about today, a policy that pulls a bunch of Black and Hispanic students out of California's most selective public universities, changes the composition in the rest of those universities, and has long-run economic ramifications for California's young Black and Hispanic populations. What we're going to now do today is turn to what I sort of thought of as the next question in this sequence of projects. First, what happens economically to Black and Hispanic students and the white and Asian students who took their place. Next, what happened in all of the subsequent policy changes that followed the end of affirmative action. And today, what happens to the white and Asian students who are still at Berkeley and UCLA, but are now attending universities that are dramatically less diverse? Yeah, there was a question here.
This might be appropriate for once we cover this part. What if there's a positive economic shock? So after the pandemic started, there was the influx of money. But what about this conversation regarding reparations that people in the state of California have had? What if there isn't a positive economic shock? Will we see a difference? Is there anything that we could predict about what might happen?
Sorry, you're asking if California were to implement a policy to provide reparations to the descendants of the formerly incarcerated, the formerly enslaved, would that be able to sort of undo the negative consequences of the end of race-based affirmative action? Is that the question you have in mind? And I'm not sure I have a very clear answer to that question, or at least it seems totally plausible. To give you a sense of magnitudes, the end of affirmative action decreased the total number of high-earning Black and Hispanic workers in California who were in their like mid-30s, 15 years after the ban, by about 3%. right? So remember that there's lots of ways to become rich in California. One way is access to Berkeley and UCLA, but there are many others. Ending affirmative action took access to these universities away from some set of thousands of Black and Hispanic students who were now enrolling at less selective public universities in the state. That then reduced the number of high-earning Black and Hispanic workers by like 3%. You could easily, I think, imagine many other policies that the state of California could have implemented, and I guess still could implement, to provide benefits to young Black and Hispanic workers to regain those 3 percentage points. And I'm trying to think, I don't think I know very much more about exactly how to think of the magnitudes of those policies on outcomes for young Black and Hispanic Californians. Okay, so turning to today's question. What we're thinking about now is, why was affirmative action implemented in the first place? One reason to implement affirmative action may be for exactly the reason I think that we were just discussing, which is effectively a sort of reparations, or at least a closing of inequities, or a raising up of individuals who may not have had access to similar educational opportunity prior to age 18. But according to the Supreme Court in the Bakke decision of the 1970s, that's not the reason you're allowed to implement affirmative action policies. The reason you're allowed to implement affirmative action policies is what Lewis Powell called the educational benefits that flow from a diverse student body. The idea is not just that affirmative action will benefit targeted Black and Hispanic students, but it will benefit everyone by leading to a more diverse student body that will lead to greater integration or cohesion on campus. Now, I think there are a couple of different ways of cashing out what those educational benefits that flow from a diverse student body are. So you might, at least as a first pass, think that there are supposed to be academic benefits here, that having more diverse classrooms will lead to greater learning. I think there are a couple of people in this room actually have contributed to this literature. I think it's pretty difficult to find evidence that having greater differences in classrooms will lead to greater learning in those classrooms. Instead, I think it's a little easier to cash out this educational benefit of diversity in terms directly of social integration and cohesion. The idea is, if you have people from lots of different backgrounds who are all mixing together in the classroom, students will be socialized into diverse communities. They'll become more comfortable in talking to and interacting with people from different backgrounds. They may even shift their preferences. They may like to be in more diverse communities. And this might have long-run ramifications for the social integration and cohesion of the United States. On the other hand, there have been a series of fairly influential papers that have suggested that exactly the opposite might happen in this context. What if you bring a bunch of low-testing Black and Hispanic students into a university, and the white and Asian students look at them and actually reject them for this reason, right? The two groups feel very separate. They might actually end up being even more separate after this forced mixing than they were beforehand. What we're going to be testing today is these social integration and cohesion outcomes, or you might think of them as intergroup relations. What we're asking is, does college integration or improved academic match, this is what happens at the less selective UC campuses where the number of Black and Hispanic students doesn't change, but the academic preparation of those students relatively improves. Does this generate social integration and cohesion in the long run for impacted students? So the way we're going to study that is using a series of research designs, mostly leveraging this Proposition 209 shock that ended affirmative action in California. Think of the shock as happening in a couple of different varieties. We have UC Berkeley, which lost about 40% of its Black and Hispanic students. We have the other UC campuses where only academic match between white and Asian students on the one hand and Black and Hispanic students on the other hand improved. We're also going to look at what happens at the University of California's graduate schools, which also saw roughly 50% declines in Black and Hispanic enrollment, in particular at the medical, law, and business schools of several UC campuses. Our primary measures of integration and cohesion are going to be following people for about 25 years and looking at the neighborhoods they live in and asking whether those neighborhoods are racially integrated, looking at the elementary school districts that they're living in and asking whether those schools are integrated, looking at the race of their spouse and asking whether people who attend more integrated universities end up marrying across racial lines with greater likelihood. And we'll also see a bunch of other information about workplace characteristics. We'll have political affiliation, etc. Yeah, Eric, there was a question.
I think by match you mean, thank you. I think by match you mean something like the variability in incoming achievement levels
That's exactly right, which is to say, so if you consider UC San Diego,
Right.
there were bigger average gaps in test scores between URM and non-URM students before relative to after the affirmative action ban.
The mean level between Berkeley, UCLA, and the other campuses also increased. That is like, on average, the
Yes.
Berkeley students were
That's
high.
right. So the gaps between schools rose and within schools fell. Yeah. And I think I'll show you a little bit of that. Yeah. And there's going to be a couple of different research designs. We're just going to look first what happened at these universities before and after the end of race-based affirmative action. We'll have difference in difference designs comparing the campuses to each other, as well as triple difference designs looking within the campuses. For example, thinking about what happens at UC Berkeley among students who either came from very racially non-integrated backgrounds, so like kids who you might think would have been most impacted by going to a university that was racially integrated, kids whose high schools were almost all white or Asian. Alternatively, you could imagine kids who were in highly integrated majors, so students who had very high interaction with Black and Hispanic students under the affirmative action regime, and then asking what happens when many of those Black and Hispanic students disappear. And then just in the last 5 or 10 minutes of today's class, I'll show you evidence from a very similar but slightly different research design. For all of this period, so from the 90s through the 2000s, we also have all of the Berkeley roommate matches. And so we're able to sort of dive into UC Berkeley and ask, if you had a randomly assigned Black or Hispanic roommate as a white or Asian student, does that change all of these outcomes? You can think of this as like a mechanism, one way by which affirmative action could impact these long-run outcomes. And because we not only have the roommate assignments, but also the algorithm that assigned roommates, as well as all of the information that went into that algorithm, this is going to be effectively lottery analysis. We're going to be able to compare people with equal likelihoods of having a Black or Hispanic roommate, one of whom did and the other of whom did not. Yeah, Peter.
Zach, how are you thinking about the interpretation here? Should we think of the treatment as you both are going to interact with fewer URM students, but then also people who are more similar to you academically?
Great. So think of what's going on at Berkeley as being a combination of fewer Black and Hispanic students, but the average Black and Hispanic student is more like you. More like you in terms of academic preparation. Yeah. And then at these other campuses, it's only the second thing. And so what I'm going to show you, I think, what I think of as sort of the main specification here is a difference in difference, comparing what happens at Berkeley to what happens at the other campuses. So it's sort of partialing out the differences in match and just focusing on what happened when half of the Black and Hispanic students at Berkeley disappeared.
Thanks.
And I'll show you all of that. This is the, oh yeah.
Will you talk about the, will you talk about the magnitudes of the differences in the gaps?
Yes, I will show you all of the first stages.
Because you're assuming that they're going to difference out, but it might be that the variance is, okay.
Yeah, don't worry, it's coming. There's going to be about 3 more slides of text, and then everything from that forward is just figures. I'm going to show you a lot of data today. This is the normal part in the talk where I preview results. I'm not going to preview results. I'm going to keep you all hanging of what actually happens, and instead just quickly tell you how this relates to a large literature. So there's a tremendous amount of interest in intergroup contact and its long-run ramifications for kids. I would say that relative to this quite large literature, some of which happens in the educational space, though much of it happens outside of the educational space, we're contributing 3 things. So the first thing we're looking at is a really big shock. We are really dramatically changing these universities. We're also, in the context of roommates, pretty substantially changing these kids' first years in college. So we're changing, this is a very serious kind of contact that we're implementing. It's not like an experiment in a classroom for a day or 2. A second thing we're looking at is real-world long-run outcomes. So I think this is very important. Almost all of this literature is looking at very short-run outcomes. For example, there are a relatively large number of recent studies, these are the best 2, that have focused on ramifications of having a Black roommate on the racial composition of individuals' friend groups and on measures of racial prejudice for individuals. But both of those papers are measuring kids when they're in their senior year. So you randomize something in freshman year and you see how their life is different senior year. they both pick up meaningful effects. So it looks like having a black roommate does lower prejudice and increase the likelihood of having a black friend in your senior year. We're going to be following people from age 26 through their early to mid 40s. So we're going to be now looking in the very long run, basically asking if this stuff persists, if there's a way in which universities are actually meaningfully, in the long run, changing racial integration and cohesion. And then finally, as I've mentioned, we're not only going to be looking at the number of Black and Hispanic students that are available at the campus for the white and Asian students who are enrolled there, but also looking at academic match within these campuses. So let me give you one slide on what the data is, though I promise that more figures are coming. Basically what you should have in mind is we have just a tremendous amount of information from the University of California system. So among other things, we have the complete student transcripts for UC Berkeley and 5 other campuses. So the full system has 9 undergraduate campuses. We're missing 3, plus UC Merced, which was not open at the time. But we have most of UC's campuses, including UC Berkeley, one of the schools that saw a large enrollment decline. You'll see that UCLA is not a campus that has ever given me data. In addition to those student transcripts over a 21-year period, they're linked to sociodemographic characteristics, characteristics from students' applications that include their SAT score and their home address and high school. You can see all the courses that they take. You can see all the same information for the business, law, and medical schools at those universities. And then at Berkeley, as I mentioned, we have 15 years of their housing lottery. That is then all going to be linked to this, our key outcome data set here, which is the L2 voter registration database. So this is a database that just agglomerates all 50 states' voter registration records. Think about what's useful about a voter registration record. First is that it has a name and birth date, so that's going to allow us to link these students forward, at least among males. I'll show you what's going on with females, which becomes a little more complicated due to name changes. In addition to name and birth date, which is going to facilitate a link, we have a home address as reported in the voter registration record. So that's going to tell us the racial composition of the neighborhood by linking that to the US Census. L2 is going to provide a predicted race for individuals. We can test the quality of this predicted race. They're primarily using name information as well as a bunch of off limits to us commercial data that seems to do a quite good job of identifying both Black and Hispanic students, though it does a better job for Hispanic. Note that we're only going to be using predicted race for spouses. We know our own students' races, but we're then going to be using L2 to identify other people living at this same residential address and identify spouses in that group. The predicted race will tell us the race of those spouses. I'll show you some validity checks to make sure those data are what we think they are. You can see political party, you can see voter participation, but we won't care about that. For the most part, we're going to be using the national voter registration record, so it's all 50 states combined, for 2023. We also have the California voter registration record annually back to 2006. That's going to give us a little bit of time series, so how each of these measures changes over time. I'll just show you 1 or 2 slides that leverage this annual data. I'll also note that an advantage of L2 is that it has email addresses, phone numbers, and home addresses, so we can contact all these folks. We're just about to put a survey in the field. If folks have ideas for questions you'd like us to ask, please let me know right now. That's a big reason that I'm presenting this here. And hopefully you have ideas as I go through what we've already collected. All of those L2 data are going to be linked to lots of publicly available information. So the US Census will tell us the racial composition of neighborhoods at the census block level. The California Department of Education will tell us the URM shares of elementary schools, as well as the catchment zones of those elementary schools. And we'll have average income by zip code from the IRS. We've linked to lots of other information, including wages, information from professional licensing agencies. I'll call this out as it goes through, but it's not going to play a major role in today's talk. Okay, let me start showing you some data. So I'm about to show you a bunch of figures that look something like this. So let me just make sure that we're all on the same page here. So these figures are going to have either 2 or 4 series on them. There's always going to be a blue series in circles. These are just average outcomes for UC Berkeley. And so just to be clear, what I'm showing you here is the share of people at UC Berkeley among men, the share of all students who match to the L2 database, right? So like, just did I find you in the voter registration record? And you can see that we're matching about 80% of Berkeley men, and we're only matching something like 50 to 60% of Berkeley women. For women, this is upward sloping. That's because we're matching to 2023, so these women are younger, they're less likely to have been married, and so less likely to have changed their name by the time we try the match. Because you can see that we have this sample selection issue for women, we're just going to omit the women from our sample. Now, everything that I show you for men is also true for women. We have that in the paper. You can combine them. It seemed to me more reasonable because data quality is substantially higher for men, just to show you what's going on for men. You'll also notice that there's no change in likelihood of match for women right at this Prop 209 boundary. So because we're primarily going to be focused on what happens right here during this policy change, these are the first freshmen who enrolled at Berkeley without affirmative action. These are the last freshmen who enrolled at Berkeley with affirmative action. There's nothing meaningful going on there. It's not going to get in the way of any of our analysis. The open circles are the share of matches for all of the other UC campuses, places that didn't have changes in the number of Black and Hispanic students, but did have changes in their composition. There was a question that I ignored. Yes?
Is the difference between UC's Berkeley and the other campuses?
Is that a class difference and tendency to change one's last name when they get married?
Yes. That's exactly what's going on. So it looks like Berkeley students are substantially less likely to change their names. They also come from much higher income backgrounds. I think that probably explains it.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Next point of data clarification is what do we mean when we say spouse? So here's how we're going to define spouse. We're going to look you up in the L2 voter registration database. If you're not registered to vote, if you're one of these 20% of men who we were not able to match, either because you're not registered, because you're not a citizen, or because there are two people with the same name and birth date, and we're not sure which one of them is you, you're going to be out of this sample. But if we were able to find you, now we're going to go look for your spouse. How do we look for your spouse? We find all the people who live at the same address as you, and we try to, based on birth dates, we ask how many of them are within 15 years of your age. If there is only one person within 15 years of your age, they are your spouse. We're going to define that person as spouse. I can give you some characteristics of these people. So, for example, of men in this sample, 90% of spouses are women, but 10% are men. That could be because of roommates, it could be because of same-sex marriages, or it could just be because of other forms of partnership. No matter for what reason these people live together, recall that these are people in their mid-40s. So this is not a circumstance of like people in their 20s who are living with roommates. Whoever that person is, that's the person we're going to call spouse. And what I'm showing you here is about 60 to 65% of these people have a spouse when we look for them in 2023. Yes?
Count it in terms of spouses rather than just calculating whether you live with people of a different race?
I have not looked at whether you live with people of a different race. I also haven't looked at the number of people you live with. Those are available statistics. I only counted it in terms of marriage because there's a large literature on interracial marriage in particular, and it would let us compare magnitudes. But I'm with you. I should absolutely show a number that just asks, do you live with someone of a different race? And I will answer the question. One thing I will note is children won't be included in here because, of course, children are not registered to vote, right? So only people over the age of 18 are going to show up in this data. Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. Sorry to not have it for you. Next thing to show you is just the first stage. So here's what happens at Berkeley and at the other UC campuses to the share of all students coming in as freshmen who are on the left Black and on the right Hispanic. Now you'll see I've added two additional series here. So we still have the blue dots for Berkeley and the black and white dots for the other UC campuses. I've added a solid black line. That's just showing you the overall California average for 18-year-olds so in that birth cohort. And then I have this dotted line. So the dotted line is for states that border California plus Washington. So it's Washington, Oregon, Nevada, and Arizona. The only reason to show you bordering states is in case you were worried that Prop 209 could affect all of California in some meaningful way on the outcomes that I'm about to show you, it might be useful to have a couple of states that were just not at all impacted by the policy. what I want you to see is that in these birth cohorts, only about 4% of Californians are Black, but about 6% of Berkeley students were Black. Actually, the year before, it was almost 7%. Before that crashes down, that comes down just to about, just below the California state average. It went from about 7 to about 3% Black students in the freshman cohort at UC Berkeley. And you can see in Hispanic, it went from like 12, about 12 to about 7. So a little less than a 50% decline in Hispanic enrollment. You'll also see there was a bounce back in Hispanic enrollment. I'll show you where that comes from in a moment, but I can tell you the policy context in which that bounce back occurred is that Berkeley was sued by the NAACP for discriminating against Black applicants in its 1998 cohort, and seems to have changed admissions policies as part of a settlement of that lawsuit. Okay, so note, right, this is a lawsuit from the left. Okay, so that's what's going on at Berkeley, and as we saw before, there's no meaningful change in Black and Hispanic enrollment at the other UC campuses. I just wanted to quickly show you what the gender distribution of this looked like, honestly, because it was something I hadn't looked at in other papers, and it turned out to be a little bit interesting. You'll see there's a pretty substantially larger decline for female Black and Hispanic students than male Black and Hispanic students. So I think this sort of plays interestingly in our favor. We're going to be focused on the male students, and so there's actually a smaller change in the composition of male Black and Hispanic students, and a bigger change in the most likely spousal composition for those students, white, Asian, Black, and Hispanic at Berkeley, though both see notable declines and both saw notable upticks in 1999 following the initial decline. So overall, it was about a 40% decline in Black and Hispanic enrollment, though it was more like 30% and 50% when you split male and female. Yes?
I have a clarifying question. Do you know what was like? It's so good. So I guess my question is it also possible to maybe use some of like what we're seeing with elections to track what's going on with enrollment? So, I mean, I'm just throwing out something here. I'm not an ed person, but I love you guys. I'm wondering if like presidential elections might play a role in student enrollment at all. Like, I don't know if people saw like President Obama and they're like, oh, maybe I should go, right? Like, so it'd be interesting to see, even if there's any kind of relationship there, even if they're, just like descriptively.
I won't click back here, but I showed you that overall URM time series year over year. There's not gigantic year over year fluctuations that I think you would need to explain by presidential elections. Now you'll notice something I didn't mention here is this. Right? So actually, Prop 209 was barely the largest decline in Black and Hispanic enrollment at UC Berkeley. There was a similar decline between 1989 and 1990. This is because of an internal report written by, at the request of, the Berkeley faculty regarding admission standards at the university. It was published by Jerome Karabel, a relatively well-known sociologist. And that was the large-scale ramification of the so-called Karabel report. The Karabel report led to a substantial decline in Black enrollment, even under the affirmative action regime at UC Berkeley. You can see there's no change in Hispanic enrollment. So that's just result of internal politics, not external politics. Okay, so next thing I'm going to show you is what's going on in terms of on-campus exposure to Black and Hispanic students. So what I'm showing you here is 3 series. I'm sorry that it's a little bit busy. I just haven't figured out a better way of visualizing this. Let's start by looking at the squares and triangles. So ignore, start by looking at the triangles and stars. Ignore the squares for a second. So the triangles and stars are showing us among white and Asian male freshmen enrolling at Berkeley, what share of them have a Black, Hispanic, or Native American roommate, and what share of their floor mates in their dormitory are Black or Hispanic in their freshman year. And what you can see is those numbers had been at about 20%, and they fall to about 12%. That almost exactly maps the change in overall URM enrollment at this school. It falls by 40%, this falls by 40%. So there's about 8 percentage points of white and Asian men who lose their Black and Hispanic roommate. However, you'll notice if you don't look at roommates, instead you focus on the squares. The squares are the URM share of your class peers. The squares don't look as discontinuous. And the reason they don't look as discontinuous is that these kids, the kids who were the last cohort to come in under the affirmative action regime, when they were sophomores, the freshmen didn't have affirmative action. And so to the degree that sophomores took courses with students who were younger than them, they would have already been sort of like partially treated by the end of affirmative action. Now, most people's friend groups are within their class, and so I think you should still think of these kids as being pretty different from these kids in terms of their on-campus exposure to affirmative action. But something to keep in mind as I show you a couple of subsequent series is that to some degree, these kids and these kids, they're sort of partially treated. They're enrolling at campuses that haven't yet completely changed as a result of the end of Berkeley's affirmative action program. Okay, I'm going to sort of breeze through this, but there are three figures here that are just showing you balance of characteristics across these kids. So what you're going to see is, for example, there's no change over this period among non-URM Berkeley students or non-Berkeley students in the average income of these kids' home zip codes. So what we're asking is, like, over time, is it the case that the non-URM students at Berkeley or the other campuses are coming from higher income families, as revealed by where their family lives? Nothing really going on for non-URM students. You can see there is a pretty substantial change for URM students. It actually, I think, goes in the opposite direction you might have expected. Affirmative action ends, and the average URM student starts enrolling at Berkeley from a relatively lower income background. Now, that's not because they aren't more academically prepared. In fact, here, this second figure, I'm going to show you the average academic performance of these students at Berkeley and the other campuses. And you can see these are now higher performing URM students, but interestingly, they come from relatively lower income backgrounds. Now, you can also see that at the other campuses, you also had this relatively small jump up in the average academic performance of URM students at these schools. So there's relative academic performance increases here. But I want to emphasize, if you compare the URM figure to the non-URM figure, the y-axes are not the same, right? So notice that these URM students are far lower performing on average than the average non-URM students at the same universities. The gap is closing, but it's only closing a little bit, right? So the way to interpret the grade point average here is this is essentially just the average GPA that you get in your courses, adjusting those GPAs for the easiness of the course. So it's from a two-way fixed effect model where I'm showing you the individual fixed effect and partialing out a course fixed effect across course GPAs. So what you can see is that the typical Berkeley URM student is earning roughly mean grades, but those are mean grades as measured over the entire University of California system, which is to say these URM students are at the mean of all University of California students, whereas the non-URM students at Berkeley are performing at 0.6 GPA points higher than them, which is to say, had those students enrolled at another UC campus, a typical average UC campus, they would have been much higher academic performance than the URM students enrolling at that school. So affirmative action, rather absent affirmative action, you still have these quite large academic gaps between URM and non-URM students, but those gaps have at least to some degree closed with the end of race-based affirmative action. Yeah?
What do you make of the dip in the grades
before the policy is enacted?
You mean this downward slope?
No, the blue line for Berkeley.
Oh, here. That's a fair question. It's not something I've thought about very much. So the implication is in the 4 years before affirmative action was banned, Berkeley starts enrolling relatively lower academically performing URM students. I'm open to interpretation, but I don't have a good story for why that would be.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the zero here is all the UC campuses in your data. Thank you. I think it would be interesting to see, maybe you've tried this. This is not, but I will talk loud. I think it would be interesting to see, like, could you make the y-axis in some of these first stage figures where the student falls in their class?
Yeah.
Of their class?
Yep.
Like, yeah.
It's totally doable. I have it in the paper. I don't have the button to it here. I apologize. But yes, I will send it over. Last thing I'll just quickly note. So this is the URM share of the high school these kids come from. You'll see there's nothing going on at the non-Berkeley campuses, but at the Berkeley campuses, you have this kind of peculiar jump up for both URM and non-URM students in 1999. I had hinted at this earlier. That's where you saw the rebound the year after the affirmative action ban. You can see that Berkeley starts targeting average high URM high schools, which pulls in more URM students, but also more non-URM students from high schools that enrolled more URM students. So this jump up is probably the result of some mistargeting by UC Berkeley in its admissions decisions. Yes?
Sorry, do you mind just going back a slide? So shouldn't we see a closing of the gap on the right? So shouldn't there be a reversion back to like the 0.6 line on the left of non-URM students relative to URM students? Is there still some level of affirmative action happening in different ways that is allowing lower achieving students?
Yeah, so this is the same thing I mentioned in the beginning. It's clear that the university continues to provide admissions advantages to relatively low opportunity students who are lower performing and who tend to be URM, though the admissions advantage cannot be on the basis of their being URM. Right? These are probably students who are getting into, say, UC Berkeley, not because they're stellar high school students in the state distribution, but because, for example, they're stellar high school students given the opportunities that they had, so maybe attending a relatively more disadvantaged high school. Okay, it's now going to take me about 3 minutes to show you all of the results in the paper. So I've set you up. You have all of the setting. Hopefully, what I can now do is just show you some figures that look exactly like these, but the y-axis is going to be the outcomes of interest. And you're just going to see what happens between 1997 and 1998 in all of these outcomes of interest. So let me show you a couple of them. The first thing I'll show you is on the left, residential integration. So this is the URM share of the census block that these people live in 2023. And on the right, the URM share of the elementary school whose catchment zone these individuals live in 2023. You'll see there's nothing going on the left, so this is totally flat. There's maybe a little bit going on the right, but it kind of goes in the wrong direction, right? Like affirmative action ends, and the white and Asian students 15 years later or 20 years later are living in elementary school districts that are a little bit more URM in subsequent years. Though I'll emphasize, when you stick this into a regression, this is not statistically significant. Yes?
Are you fixing the characteristics of the elementary schools, or if there are changes in residential segregation and integration, and people are in exactly the same place, would this be shifting over time?
Good question. Yes, I am fixing the URM share of of elementary schools in 2015. So it's a couple of years before this. But it's when these parents are much more likely to have had kids in elementary schools. But the elementary schools are fixed over time. The residential blocks are also fixed over time. You only get those decennially. So actually, there might be a switch from the No, it's all from the 2020 census. Yeah. Okay. So it doesn't look like there's very much going on here. Here's what's going on in the share with the URM spouse. There's nothing going on at the non-Berkeley campuses. And once again, at Berkeley, it looks like things are kind of going in the wrong direction. Affirmative action ends, and if anything, white and Asian students appear to be more likely to have Black or Hispanic spouses 20 years later, relative to the cohorts that enrolled at Berkeley with affirmative action. As I'll show you in a moment, this does show up to be pretty statistically significant, though it depends a little bit on specification. So let me just show you now a couple of regressions to put these in context. I'm then going to show you a little bit of information from the roommate randomization that will, I think, help characterize these a little bit more. And then we'll have about 10 minutes just for open discussion. But now the cat's out of the bag. This is a null results paper, and it doesn't look like very much is happening at the end of race-based affirmative action in terms of racial integration and cohesion, at least not in the direction that I suspect many of us would have hoped from the affirmative action program. So here's just a couple of different research designs that get at this coefficient. So the outcome is the URM share of your residential block in 2023. And what we're asking is first, single difference, so just after the end of affirmative action versus before, where here I'm reporting the effect under the affirmative action regime. So it's kind of the opposite of the normal diff and diff. I'm showing you the results pre relative to the results post. So there's no change in residential block among Berkeley students under the affirmative action regime versus not. This is just using a couple of years before versus a year after the end of the affirmative action program. Here, I'm looking at Berkeley versus the other University of California campuses in a diff and diff. That's going to be null. And even if you just restrict to very high testing kids who could have gotten in whether or not the affirmative action program was implemented, that's going to show up as null. Maybe just to give you a sense of magnitudes here. So the mean of Y, you'll notice, is about 20. The standard deviation is 16. Right? So here, we're bounding these results at less than 0.1 standard deviations of change in the URM composition of these kids' neighborhoods. Here, we're looking at Berkeley versus either the entire state of California, excluding Berkeley, or versus everyone who came from the neighboring states to California. Once again, doesn't look like very much is happening in terms of neighborhood composition. Here's what happens when you stick in the share with a URM spouse. So notice that the mean is now quite low, right? So it's like 6 or 8% of white and Asian guys have a Black or Hispanic spouse. But it seems like, if anything, under the affirmative action regime, that number is lower. Now, if you compare it to the full state of California or bordering states, it becomes statistically insignificant, or maybe only significant at the 10% level. But what it looks like is going on is, under the affirmative action regime, it looks like white and Asian guys are a little bit less likely to have Black and Hispanic spouses. Yeah, Sue.
Do you have any positive mechanism for that direction, or you just think it's noise or something?
Let me hold that and come back to it right at the end.
Okay.
I think part of the answer may be revealed in a survey, but let me hold it for a few minutes.
I think academic match may beget romantic match.
If that were the case, then you might expect this table at the other UC campuses to show positive results. I'm not going to click on the button now, but that's all null. You've already seen it in the figure. There's nothing going on at the other campuses. Yes?
So if you go back one slide, so here you're using an absolute measure of integration.
Yeah.
What does this look like if you do something relative, like dissimilarity?
Totally. I don't see it in the buttons there. So here's a couple more things you could do. You could include county fixed effects. So you just compare within county. Everything looks null. You could look at gentrification measures. So to what degree has your census block become more or less URM over the previous 10 years? That's null. I think those are all the things you can stick in 2010 URM share directly, and that's going to be null as well. Yeah?
Sorry, just to clarify, because you mentioned graduate schools, is this just undergrad?
This is just undergrad. I'll show you graduate schools in just a moment. I don't think it'll spoil the story to tell you that it's going to look very similar to this. Yeah?
Do you know, I guess there was a decline in the Black population among students. Do you know the gender breakdown of that?
Yes, the decline was much larger for women than for men. So if anything, you might have expected that to push this even more positive. But yeah, no, the decline's much larger for women. Yep, yes?
Sorry for the double question. Do you look at what majors people are choosing, and has that changed in response to?
Yeah, so Black and Hispanic students are going to become a little bit less likely to earn STEM majors after the end of affirmative action across the UC system. There's not very much happening inside of Berkeley. I don't think I have a figure on it here, but yeah, a little less likely to earn STEM degrees.
Thank you.
I promised you one figure of time profile. So as I mentioned, we have the voter registration database every year from 2006 to present for the state of California. So this is just showing you those same difference in difference estimates for URM share of residential block and URM share of local elementary school annually from age 26 to age 43. You can see maybe in the beginning you could try to convince yourself Berkeley versus California that kids are living in slightly more racially integrated neighborhoods when they're still in their 20s, but it's clearly fully faded out by age 30, and there's nothing going on after age 30. In terms of elementary school, if anything, it starts flipping in the other direction when you get into people's 40s.
So do you mind clarifying that? You mean they're living in less diverse neighborhoods?
That's right. So it looks like kids who enrolled at Berkeley under the affirmative action regime if anything, among white and Asian students, if anything, are living in neighborhoods that have elementary schools that are slightly less diverse by the time they're in their 40s, relative to white and Asian kids who went to Berkeley without the affirmative action regime. I promised you a couple of comparisons within Berkeley. I'll just breeze through this because they're all nulls. One thing you can do is focus on kids who were in high URM majors, so white and Asian kids in majors that were very exposed to Black and Hispanic roommates. That's going to be null on everything. You can instead look at kids who went to high schools that were very not diverse, so you might have expected them to be more impacted by the policy. Focusing on those students is going to be null for both residential integration and URM spouses. We have lots of other outcomes. Everything about share Republican and Democrat is null. Voting behavior is null. We have stuff on public service professions. We've looked at a series of survey questions about travel preferences. Do you like traveling domestically or traveling internationally? That stuff is all null. Let me quickly just show you two figures on graduate school. So here we're looking at medical schools, law schools, and business schools. On the left, I'm showing you the first stage. This is the just decline in URM enrollment at these schools following the end of Proposition 209. And you can see at both medical schools and law schools, about 50% declines. At business schools, about a 40% decline in URM enrollment. Now, on the right, I'm showing you interracial marriage rates. Those are super noisy, right? Because these are much smaller schools than the undergraduate schools. Each of these, I think there's 3 each of medical school, law school, and business school. So we have total enrollments on the order of 400 or 500 students. But if anything, you can see this same pattern here. It looks like, if anything, kids who went to business schools, law schools, or medical schools without the affirmative action regime would have been, if anything, more likely to marry URM spouses than kids who went to those schools absent the affirmative action regime. I guess this is most surprising for business schools, which only exist for the generation of marriages. And nevertheless, after affirmative action ends, white and Asian kids become a little bit more likely to marry Black and Hispanic people who couldn't have been at those schools. Yeah?
You say they're noisy, but the variance is very different on the right and on the left.
Yes, that's because URM spouse is a rare outcome.
To the left of the,
sorry.
The negative period, that's much lower variance than it is on the right.
I agree, and I don't have an answer to that question. I should have an answer to that question. But I agree, the variance is higher. Thanks, I don't have an answer. A last thing, I'll just say this out loud, but there's a substantial concern in the medical community that if you end affirmative action, you'll have fewer practicing Black and Hispanic doctors, and so you'll have fewer doctors practicing in majority-minority neighborhoods. And so what I'm doing here is, again, just showing you on the left the decline in the overall graduation of URM doctors coming out of University of California medical schools. It declines, though not super substantially. And then on the right, for URM students, everyone, and non-URM students, I'm showing you the average URM composition of the zip codes of practice of all of these doctors once they're actually practicing medicine following law school. We have that from medical licensing records. And what you can see is overall, there is no change in the URM composition of the neighborhoods where these doctors practice medicine. That's because, somewhat interestingly, even though there are fewer URM doctors, it seems like, if anything, the URM doctors start practicing in higher URM share neighborhoods, counteracting any otherwise decline in the average URM share of the neighborhoods where these doctors practice medicine. This could be selection or treatment effect. It could be that we're taking different URM students, or it could be because there were fewer URM students in the medical school, those URM students choose to practice in more URM neighborhoods. That's not going to be observed here. I hope you'll forgive me for misusing time. I had hoped at this point to tell you a bunch about roommates. Instead, I'm only going to be able to just tell you out loud what we find with roommates. And long story short, it's just going to exactly follow this story. If you randomly assign a white or Asian guy to a Black or Hispanic roommate, you do not change their likelihood of living in a more diverse neighborhood. You do not change the elementary school. You do not change the likelihood of interracial marriage. In fact, if anything, that coefficient is slightly negative. I will note that if you do the same exercise with URM students, you see a little bit of evidence that URM students do become more racially integrated if you assign them a white or Asian roommate. So assigning a Hispanic student to a white roommate does lead them to be a little bit more likely to marry a white spouse or live in a whiter neighborhood as an adult, but no effect on the on the white or Asian men. Sorry to have run out of time, but I wanted to make sure just to save a little bit of time for questions. So I'm going to stop there. The long story short that I want you to take away from this study is that while affirmative action seems to be very successful as a redistributive policy and as an efficiency-gaining policy for providing economic gains to Black and Hispanic students that exceed any losses to their white and Asian peers, it does not appear, at least on these measures, to be a policy that generates interracial integration or cohesion across racial lines, at least with regard to targeted white and Asian students at more or less diverse universities. So thanks for your attention. Sorry for misuse of time, but we've got 10 minutes to talk a little bit about the results.
In theory, I'm supposed to manage the questions, but I don't want to.
Excellent. It'd be my pleasure to manage questions and send people around to, and I should say, if no one has any questions, I'll show you some results on roommates, but I have a feeling it's worth having a short conversation.
So I have a roommate question.
Fantastic.
Is the effect of being assigned to a URM roommate, does it depend on the gap in achievement level between the students? And does that coefficient on the gap in achievement level change between
Great.
1995 and 1990?
So the part of that question I can answer is if you just look, just to be clear, I'm going to show you some results. I want you to focus on these results that have an X in this row. So this row is controlling for the likelihood with which you're assigned a URM roommate. So conditional on a non-parametric function of the propensity score, you can interpret these results causally. What I want you to see is, so this is during affirmative action and after affirmative action. Now, in terms of elementary school and URM spouse, this stuff doesn't look very different from each other. There's maybe a little bit of evidence that you can't differentiate these two, that maybe roommates were leading URM students, leading white and Asian students to live in, I think, slightly more diverse neighborhoods. Under the affirmative action regime, though that effect disappears after the affirmative action regime, though I think the broad takeaway here is there's no clear evidence of differential effects under the affirmative action regime or not. Now, I'm using that to answer your question because, of course, in this period, the match would have been somewhat worse than in this period academically. However, you can just separate by match and try to look at what happens specifically in cases where the match is better. It's on my to-do list, and I just have not done it yet. So this is unfortunately, I think, the best that I've got for you right now. Yes?
Does anybody else have a question? Because I've asked lots of questions.
You're on, Peter.
You started this talk motivating it by the reasoning in the Bakke decision, which was that, in a sense, minorities were an educational amenity for non-minorities. Take us back to that in light of your results. Like, is your kind of conclusion that the holding in the court lacks an evidentiary basis, and so that's not a suitable rationale for affirmative action policies, or is it that, in a sense, universities aren't really productive at doing these things of promoting integration? So I'd be interested to get your perspective, opine a little bit, because you've written a lot about this topic. And so I know as economists, we're not very normative, but I want to get your big picture takeaway from this.
So I definitely don't think there is an evidentiary basis for the educational benefits of diversity. As I hinted at the beginning of the talk, I think typically when you look at academic returns to more diverse classrooms, you find things that go in the opposite direction. It's like it's easier to teach classrooms that are relatively more academically homogeneous than heterogeneous. This is, I think, the clearest evidence we have on what happens when you foster diversity on campuses in terms of racial integration and cohesion. And again, in this context, it doesn't seem to be very impactful. Right, so the way I had concluded, I think, is exactly what I'm going to go back to here, which is it appears that race-based affirmative action is justified on two alternative criteria. So I think there's the criteria that we're all very familiar with, which is affirmative action is good for Black and Hispanic students, and it's thus worth implementing this policy because it aids these relatively disadvantaged and historically harmed groups. I think it's also worth emphasizing the efficiency ramifications of affirmative action. This is not to say that affirmative action is an efficient policy. It's not optimal in any sense to provide race-based preferences. But it is the case that relative to the meritocratic consensus, the standard ways that universities do admissions, it seems that affirmative action is efficiency enhancing in that the returns to targeted students exceed the losses, if there are any losses, to the white and Asian students who they replace. That being said, Lewis Powell chose neither of those rationales as a constitutional justification for affirmative action. He chose the educational benefits of diversity. And while I'm open to others' findings of evidence of such educational benefits, I guess I've just done my best to convince you that this is the wrong place to look.
That's an excellent synopsis.
One more question.
Great.
I had a question going back to the data matching at the beginning. So I think I feel like sort of somewhat reassured by the fact, right, that the results for the matched women do tend to fall in line with the matched men.
Yep.
However, I am super curious about the like relatively large percentage of unmatched women, and
Yeah.
I'm sort of curious if you've looked into. I mean, I'm asking you to speculate here, but like, sort of, are there any reasons we might expect to see patterns in those women that are counter to the results that we see in the data that we do have? I mean, particularly because these are women, right, that we would expect to be married to someone.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sort of curious about
Yeah,
that.
it's a super interesting question. I'm not sure I have so much speculation. The best that I can say is that it's not the case that there are dramatic changes in marriage likelihoods between 1997 and 1998. So there's no change in composition right at this threshold, which is to say, whatever's going on can't be like a selection issue as a result of the policy. It would have to be an issue of heterogeneous treatment effects, that there's no effects on married men or unmarried women, but there is something going on for married women. That's possible. I guess to the degree that things don't show up for women who didn't change their name, it's actually one step further. It can't just be that the effects are for married women. They have to be for married women who changed their name. It's plausible that those women are particularly impacted by having a more racially diverse university. I wish I could say more about whether that was likely.
All right, let's give a round of applause. So our next seminar is going to be March 4th. We're going to have Anna Markowitz of UCLA on descriptive data for early education policy partners. Thanks for coming. And now you should all leave because we're going to do a private debrief for the PIER fellows. Grab your snacks and get out.